Hi guys, what we're looking at today is the Keynesian view of macroeconomics. In my previous video I spoke about the classical model, so I'd recommend checking that out before you check out this video because it kind of works in a series. So anyway, we're going to start off with a brief history of the Keynesian macroeconomics. So, straight off the back of the classical model failing during the Great Depression in the 1930s and not between the 1920s and 1930s, came the Keynesian view of the economy, and this was written in 1936, called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And essentially Keynesians were saying that we need to be looking in the long run, because the classical model was a short run and a long run aggregate supply, but Keynes only suggested that we have this long run aggregate supply. So essentially he disregarded two things: the labour market and the market for loanable funds. Essentially, in a nutshell, what John Maynard Keynes said was that with wage cuts, the market or the price cut will not fall far enough to clear the market, and as a result they would be stuck in a deflationary gap. And with the loanable funds, more people saving, if more people are saving, there's going to be less consumption. Less consumption is going to mean less spending, and there's going to be less consumption is going to mean there's going to be less things bought in the economy. If there's going to be less things bought in the economy, firms are going to have to lay off workers, and they're not going to want to invest. Therefore, a lower interest rate from these loanable funds, from the encouraging of savings, is going to have little to no effect in the economy, and actually make it worse. So, what did Keynes say? Keynes came up with this long run aggregate supply. This is the Neoclassical Zone, which was seen in the classical macroeconomics. This is the intermediate zone, and this is the Keynesian zone. And essentially what Keynes was saying is we don't just have this long run aggregate supply, we also have a horizontal part and we have this curved part. So essentially, we'll talk about this neoclassical zone first. This was known as the full employment output. This is when the economy is at max full employment. This would be the natural rate of unemployment on the Phillips curve as well. So we can mark this YFE. And essentially what Keynes was saying is that we should have government intervention to re-stimulate the economy. So if we had aggregate demand down here, we should stimulate the economy back to this YFE. Because if we're at Y1 here, what we have here is a huge, what we call a deflationary gap or recessionary gap. And the classical approach was said, if we stimulate AD, the only thing we're going to have is inflation. And this is because of the quantity theory of money and because of Say's law. Say's law saying that supply creates its own demand. However, in this case, we're looking at Keynesian's law, where he says demand creates its own supply. And you can see this because let's say we do have a shift in AD. Let's say it's because of an increase in money supply. Therefore, there's more investment in the economy. Let's say because there's more investment in the economy, which ends up shifting AD along here. As you can see, what we have is an increase in GDP and no increase in inflation, which the classical theorists would have rejected because of the quantity theory of money. So that was Keynes' idea, that we need to use these demand management policies in order to re-stimulate the economy. And we can use something called discretionary fiscal policy or discretionary monetary policy. And these were Keynes' two main ideas, the fiscal and the monetary. And what was involved in these? So, for the fiscal policy is essentially government expenditure and taxation. So changes in G is a component of aggregate demand, and changes in T, taxation. What was it supposed to do? A change in government expenditure, obviously looking at the aggregate demand components, SIG XM for short, consumption or domestic consumption, plus investment, plus government expenditure, plus net trade, which is X minus M. So as you can see, a change in government expenditure will stimulate aggregate demand, and a change in taxation will, let's say a decrease in taxation will mean there's more disposable income, which will affect domestic consumption, which will increase or change aggregate demand. Monetary policy just involved changing of interest rates and something called quantitative easing, which is buying and purchasing assets. And this was the way of re-stimulating the economy to get back out of this deflationary gap, which can be seen with using the Keynesian cross, back to the full employment output level. Once we start slowly getting back to this full employment level, we meet this intermediate zone. And in this intermediate zone, what tends to happen is the idea of, let me change that colour, the original idea of having no inflation, but a reduction in unemployment suddenly changes. We suddenly start to see an increase in inflation as well. If I just draw a dotted line across here, you can see there's an increase in inflation. And this is because all the idle machines that were previously not being used, the idle machines, the idle resources, such as land, labour, capital, enterprise, there's now more use for them, and that's going to start driving up prices. Mainly it's going to be cost push inflation. Cost push inflation up until the full employment output. And then anywhere after this, we're probably going to have demand pull inflation, where the economy is going to be overheating, and it's most likely going to lead to a boom in the business cycle and create an inflationary gap. So this was pretty much Keynesian's idea of the macroeconomy. His idea of scrapping Say's law and using his own law, where demand creates supply. The idea of rejecting the labour market and the loanable funds and the quantity theory of money, stating that I'll write the equation of exchange, or the Fisher equation, P V equals My, where the monetarists and the classical economists believe that money is a function of price. Oh, I've got that the wrong way around, 1 second. That price is a function of money. Whereas the Keynesians are saying that, yes, we can increase money supply, yes, it may lead to a little bit of inflation in the intermediate zone, but in this case, it's not leading to anything, but it could lead to an increase in Y. So, essentially, the classical economists were wrong in this case. So, thank you for listening to this video and watching. I hope this has been helpful, and next is going to be the monetarists.